We are here today in conversation with Ambassador Saran to understand both what is in store for the United States under Biden's administration, what is in store for US relations with the global order in the backdrop of events of January 6th, and importantly for all of us here in India, what are the implications for a Biden administration for the future of US-India relations? So, Ambassador Saran, thank you very much for joining us. Let me begin by asking you, given the events of January 6th, clearly, domestically, the United States is in a very fraught situation. And January 6th, I think, just brought this out in sharp relief. The Biden administration is going to be very busy domestically. What do you think this means for the administration, both in terms of how it negotiates the US's domestic challenges, but also what it means for the United States position internationally?
Thank you very much, Yamini, and I would like to thank CPR for giving me an opportunity to share some of my perspectives on this very important issue. My own sense is that the first order of business is going to be domestic. One, quite clearly, dealing with the raging pandemic, which is becoming worse, as you have seen. The inoculation program has not really progressed very well. Biden himself has said that. So the pandemic will be a first order of business. The economic recovery will be an important item on the agenda. How to deal with a very divided, polarized society is going to be another issue. So I think he will have his hands full with respect to the domestic agenda. And my sense is that even though there will be perhaps a more structured policy towards the rest of the world, the administration's bandwidth, in a sense, will be mainly taken up by the domestic challenges. So there will be less bandwidth available for dealing with the external environment. The good news is that the appointments that Biden has announced with respect to the national security staff, with respect to the State Department, White House, that does seem to indicate that he's conscious of the fact that the US needs to have strong engagement with the allies, needs to deal with adversaries like China perhaps in a much more strategic way. So he has the team which would be able to do this. But having said that, I still believe that the main focus of the Biden administration will be domestic going forward.
The era of Donald Trump saw the US retreating quite significantly from the role that it was playing in leading and negotiating global governance, multilateral institutions, particularly on issues like climate that had really taken center stage in the Obama era, but also reshaping terms of international trade. Even as the Biden administration is busy domestically, do you think that there will be an automatic reset button and we'll go back to a pre-2016 world when it comes to these global institutions and global public goods? Or do you see a big juncture and transition that will take place?
There has to be a transition, Yamini, because, the 2016 world does not exist anymore. So then what do you go back to? So much has changed in not only in terms of the international environment, but also domestically. I mean, the US is very different today, having been through, this traumatic 4 years under Trump. The rest of the world is different. China today, for example, if you compare to 2016, is a country which is much more powerful. Even if you look at the impact of the pandemic, it is one of the few large economies which has recovered rather quickly. It is today perhaps even more important as an engine of growth for the global economy than it has been in the past. So there is no going back to what was the world that we were familiar with in 2016. It is a different world. And I think the US administration, like many of us as well, will have to deal with a very, very dramatically altered geopolitical terrain. So, as I said, the good news is that there is a very professional, experienced, and perhaps a very focused kind of a team that has been put in place in order to deal with this very altered geopolitical environment. Biden himself has a huge experience as far as international affairs is concerned. So, all these, I grant, are important assets. And if you see, for example, the appointment of John Kerry as the kind of climate change special envoy, quite clearly, this is going to be a very important agenda for the United States. And US activism in that sense on some key global issues is, of course, welcome. But I believe that the kind of influence that the US had in driving some of these multilateral processes, that is much diminished. I fail to see how we can see a leadership role by the US on some of these key multilateral issues like we have been experiencing in the past. US will have to adjust to what is a much more diffuse kind of a political situation. Globally, there is a more multipolar kind of a world. You would have to, even if you have an adversarial relationship with China, how do you deal with some of these international issues without engaging with China? So I think these are very new kind of challenges that the US will be facing with perhaps less advantage than it has enjoyed in the past.
And what does this mean for US-India relations?
Yeah.
Both in terms of, I think, the two sort of frameworks of the debate that we've had so far. One is the question of will the US take a different view on many of the domestic transitions that India itself has undergone, particularly in the last 2 years. And our own sites of contestation that have opened up around governance and democracy on the one hand, but also on the other, India's sort of strategic positioning vis-a-vis the US, particularly in relation to the US's strategic relationship with China, and how the US views India in that context. The dynamics of our relationship with China have, of course, gone through their own changes, quite significant moments actually over the last few months. So where do you think these new changes, the new administration is going to position itself vis-a-vis its relationship with India, and how will we navigate these new emergent tensions?
So, in very, very stark terms, the fact that the balance of power between the US and China is certainly looks to be changing more and more in China's favor. The balance is moving more in China's favor. I don't think we can get away from that reality. Now, to the extent that the United States of America and partnership with the United States of America has given India a certain expanded room for maneuver in dealing with the China challenge, I think we have to acknowledge that perhaps space has shrunk somewhat. But there is no doubt that the Sino-US confrontation is structural in nature. It is not merely a Trumpian kind of a symptom. It had deeper roots. So, what I can see is that perhaps the nature of dealing with China will change under the Biden administration. You will probably see a resumption of high level engagement. I think if you look at, say, the climate change issue, it is a perfect issue on which the US can justify re engaging with China, because how else do you deal with a global issue of this nature? So we should be looking at confrontation continuing, but perhaps in a somewhat more muted fashion, in somewhat more subtle fashion than we have seen in the past. But it does not mean that the United States of America thereby has come to some kind of a deal with or a bargain with China. So, in that sense, U.S. interest in India as one of the key countries which can help the United States deal with the adversarial challenge from China, I do not think that will change. Now, if that doesn't change, and if the Indo-Pacific strategy, for example, of Trump continues to be irrelevant as far as Biden is concerned. And I think he has already indicated that Indo-Pacific will be a very important component of U.S. engagement with Asia. Then, in that sense, India will continue to be an important factor. But as you mentioned, this is a administration which will perhaps be much more focused on things like human rights issues, things like what is the state of democracy in the country. Uh, so perhaps there may be some irritants which may arise from time to time in the relationship. But on balance, I would say that despite those irritants, the larger interest of the United States in India as being a key component of its searching for a new balance of power, you know I think that is perhaps going to continue. Don't forget that I think the value that India has as a partner will also be very much dependent upon our own performance. The weaker we become, relatively speaking, to China, then the our value as a partner to dealing with the China challenge will be that much less. I mean, that is one of the dilemmas, is that the weaker you are, the less valuable you are as a partner or ally. The stronger you are, perhaps you don't need so much of support from other actors. But on balance, I would say that the Indo-Pacific strategy is here to stay. India will continue to be a very important component of that strategy. India can certainly look to a certain continuity in the adversarial relationship between US and China, which therefore gives us a space to sort of maneuver. But the weak point I have pointed out earlier as well is the economic aspect, both with respect to the United States, where this relationship is still somewhat fraught, as well as our own decision to somehow not really participate in the very dynamic kind of economic transformation that is taking place in Asia itself. This will hamper, to my mind, our own ability to shape the environment according to our interests. But essentially, I would say continuity in India-US relations, perhaps consolidation of that relationship, but with some areas of vulnerability which we should look out for.
So, in a sense, the ball is also partially in India's court to be
Oh,
able
yes.
to manage and navigate this relationship to our advantage at
Yes,
a time when there is a degree of global churning which
Yes.
reposition India too.
Yes, I think last point I would like to make is that we should not think that only the security component of the relationship will see us through. That there are other important pillars in the relationship which also need to be looked after, they need to be nurtured, of which I would say the economic part is perhaps the most important.
So India's path to an 8 to 10% growth is important both for us domestically, but also for what India looks like internationally as well, and how we position ourselves. So, our diplomacy is intertwined with our economic policy as well.
Very much so. If you just look at the experience that we have had in 2003 to 2007, when we were growing at the rate of 8 to 9% per annum. I always point out that, I was very fortunate to have been foreign secretary through that period, because I could sense the expansion of the strategic space that India had during that period. I do not believe, for example, that the Indo-US nuclear deal, which was a landmark, initiative, would actually have been possible. For example, if India were growing at the rate of only 4 to 5% per annum, that is what made the difference.
Thank you. I think it is important for all of us to remember that India's economic trajectory is entirely closely intertwined with India's diplomatic trajectory, and the two go together very, very closely. The future of India-US relations is as much dependent on our strategic capability as it is on our economic heft and agility. Thank you very much, Ambassador Saran, as always, for enlightening us and our listeners.